lecture will cover Chapter 9, which looks at qualitative design and looks at ethnographic and historic research methods within qualitative research. Qualitative research is a form of systematic empirical inquiry into meaning to find insightful aspects of a social situation, and it accumulates large quantities of data that illuminate the experience. It also describes and interprets data that has not been manipulated. So whenever we do quantitative data or an experimental study, you're manipulating your data. So say when we're doing a questionnaire, we're still manipulating the data because we're asking them specific questions that we want to get, and they can't tell us anything back if they're just choosing from A, B, C, and D. And also, a lot of qualitative research is going to be observation, where you are definitely not manipulating anything or interfering with the everyday happenings of a person or a thing. And the purpose of qualitative research is to uncover the meaning of the situation, the practice, or the experience. So if you look at the comparison of qualitative data looking at ethnographic and historic, ethnographic data tries to understand a cultural phenomena based on observing human interactions, and it's often termed field study. And this is because you have to usually access a site or access your research subjects. And some examples within the fashion industry of an ethnographic study that kind of looks at a phenomenon. One would be looking at a consumer shopping experience, say within a certain type of retailer. So say you wanted to see the shopping experience for a consumer within, say, Target, kind of a discount retailer. That would be an ethnographic study because you would observe how their shopping experience went, and you wouldn't actually give them a survey to ask them about their shopping experience, because once you did that, that would be turning it into quantitative. You could also look at the interaction between a shopper and a sales associate, which is definitely something that would be harder to learn about with a survey. You could also look at the exit strategy for a retail store, how someone exits and enters into a retail store. You could even look at how the process of when they pay for merchandise works. And you could also look at other things. Another thing you could look at that would be kind of a different study that would be ethnographic would be looking at how family members interact when they're observing what others wear. You could also look at how dress changes over time for an individual. And then looking at historic research, it uses a system of assembling, assessing, confirming, and combining evidence to establish facts. And it searches for the meaning and provides data for future uses and uses the experience for comparisons. And it looks at the past and looks at a phenomenon as an observable fact to be studied. And in a second, we'll talk about some different forms of historic research. So looking at some possible qualitative research strategies, when looking at ethnographic research, the ones that we're going to see used the most will be focus groups and case studies. When looking at historical research, the things that we'll see used the most will be interviews related to a phenomenon or case studies. But there is also the literature search that is done quite a bit. And things to think about when looking at qualitative research strategies is that it's a non-experimental methodology, and that data is collected, recorded, and analyzed without the manipulation of variables. So that's the big thing to remember. There's no manipulation of variables, and it's a non-experimental methodology. So looking at ethnographic research, it's a study of a phenomenon in its natural setting. The researcher does not manipulate or interfere with the everyday happenings. And the purpose of this type of research is to uncover the meaning of the situation, practice, or experience. And so it's a form of systematic empirical inquiry into meaning. And it evolved from the field of anthropology, and so there's a strong focus on cultures within it. And it's also done to accumulate large quantities of data that should illuminate the aspects of the setting. And that's another thing that's kind of different. With qualitative research, you tend to accumulate large quantities of data when you're doing something, but you're usually looking at a specific person, culture, or phenomenon, and it's not something that you can apply to the larger population. And as I said, some of the more types of ethnographic research that are used within our industry, one would be focus groups. And this is where several people are brought together to discuss open-ended questions about a product or an issue. And you have a discussion leader that leads your group for a focus group to address the topic that you want to be studied. And the discussion leader, it's important that they allow participants to speak, and it's free for open discussion to take place. And for participants, it's more or less just listening to what they have to say about something. And lots and lots of retailers use focus groups. I may have mentioned before that when I worked for JCPenney in product development in St. John's Bay, that's one thing we did a lot of was focus groups, just to see what our type of consumer was saying about our product, about the brand, about the products that we had out, the different types of shirts. We used it to look at sizing, what we need to change in sizing based on what we found the average person thinks about the sizing of the products and the quality of the products. Next are case studies, and they're an in-depth look at one person, one company, or a situation. And they can look at an occurrence or phenomenon, a person's life, work, ideas, or accomplishments. An example of one would be that's given in your book is the Triangle Factory Fire. And there were case studies done on it afterwards that looked at what were the issues, what caused the fire, and then why did so many people die in the fire. And it was actually in Manhattan in 1911. And what they learned is that there was no alarm, like fire alarm. There was no the railing to get out of the building if you were going to go down through the outside of the building. It was not installed correctly. There was no sprinklers installed. And also the doors had been locked. And also there was no fire extinguishers or fireproofing requirements for factories at this time. And after this huge fire that happened and there were so many deaths, there was actual standards set up through studying what happened that came out that showed they set standards for factories, for factory workers, for even the treatment of factory workers. They even started to provide better facilities for the bathroom facilities for workers, eating facilities for workers. So it not only changed the way that factories were set up, but it also changed the way that workers were treated. And how this was done is more through like a case study is what they looked at this actual phenomenon that happened or situation, and all of these changes came out of the study that not only helped factories but also workers to be more compliant. And looking at the ethnographic research process, the biggest thing that comes out of the ethnographic research process is that you can do all of the steps simultaneously or concurrently. And so that means that there's no order to this process. And it often involves foreshadowing problems or specific focus for the study. And the Subjects for an ethnographic study are purposefully sampled. So the population is chosen to answer the research question. And if the hypothesis is developed, it is developed while the research is in progress. And it may change as data is collected and is modified as needed. And changes are made during this research process are documented, and data collection often varies from observation to photography. So looking at the way you collect your data is very different for the type of study that you use that's considered ethnographic. And some factors to consider in doing ethnographic research are the accessibility of the setting, the public or private setting, to look to see at the cultural perspective or meaning of the different things that you'll be looking at, and also to look at ethical considerations. Next is historical research, which is the other form of qualitative research. And historical research looks at past events, developments, and experiences, and you need to consider where the evidence comes from and interpreting what it means. And historical research looks at events, developments, and experiences. Events, an example of this would be the history of the change of skirt lengths, or the history of the rise of labor unions in the textile industry. Looking at developments would be the invention of the sewing machine and the results of the changes in the family daily task. Another example for experiences would look at the analysis of a home redecorating as a reflection of family changes. So looking at how does your home look decorated whenever you're single versus when you get married, and then versus when you have children, which I think would actually be a really fun study to look at. And so why do historical research? It can bring different attitudes. It can bring clearer perspectives. It also provides better understanding of what is happening or could happen in the future. So you can use it for decision making. It also is historical research is used to forecast trends, because many times our trends that happen in fashion have already been done, and they're just things returning. So it could be fabrics or colors or silhouettes. So you can study trend styles, which is a form of historic research. Looking at the steps in the scientific method for historical research, you first want to define the problem. Then you're going to state your hypothesis, collect your data or your evidence, and then you're going to evaluate, analyze, or link the data, and then communicate, report, or interpret your findings. And this allows the researcher to look at the phenomena from a broader perspective, and it's an ongoing process that evolves over time and uses inductive data analysis. And you can think of historical research as kind of a funnel. So you're going to gather your data in one place, then you're going to analyze and interpret it, so then you can use it to describe the phenomenon. And each step can overlap, so there's new information that may change or conditionally change from one step to another. When looking at historical data, you can either have primary data, which is firsthand information, which would be a testimony of firsthand accounts, or you can have secondary sources. And this is information from someone else's writing that's already been written, or this is where someone talks about an event when they weren't there, so they're just recounting an event that they weren't even a part of, or they did not conduct the actual research for. And that's what a lot of times what you see done with historical research is you're using secondary sources. So like the shirtwaist factory was 1911, it would be very hard to get primary data for that. So pretty much all of your collection of data would be secondary sources if you were to do some kind of study that looked at it. Another thing to note about qualitative data is that there is a chance to do some descriptive statistics in qualitative data, and an example of this is kind of what y'all did when you did your observation study. you were actually able to code certain variables and give like percentages and categorize data. So you were able to look like how many females or males did you look at, or if you looked at a certain product, you could categorize like how many of a certain brand you saw, how many of a certain brand you didn't see. So you can get some descriptive statistics depending on the type of study that you're doing. You can kind of get a few descriptives off of focus groups, definitely off of interviews or observations. Finally, looking at ethnographic and historic research, doing data reduction and categorizing of information for this form of research or qualitative research is very time consuming and deliberate, and results from analysis and interpretation of the data are never final. Also, there's always new knowledge to be gained in understanding the phenomenon. And the quality of information researchers find with qualitative investigations is definitely worth the effort, because it does take so much extra time, because it digs a lot deeper than what you can get with quantitative research, and it definitely does not manipulate the setting or the subject that you're looking at in any way or their findings.